Today's episode of Light and Sight Process is going to look at how Adobe's different methods of changing contrast give different results. Hello everyone, my name is Jeremy. Thanks for joining me. Contrast is such a big component to images, and on pretty much every occasion we want a contrast to represent the intention behind our image. In digital post-processing, however, we are relying on the tools that different softwares give us to get to this desired result. However, the methods behind these processes are pretty much hidden from us. I have noticed that different ways of changing contrast give very different results. So this episode is going to dive in and analyze how these tools compare when processing images. We're firstly going to look at ACR's curves. Then we're going to look at how ACR's transformations affect the histogram. And lastly, I'll show you a couple of methods in Photoshop on how to increase contrast. I exported this gradient layer as a TIFF file, and then I opened it in Adobe Camera Raw as a smart object. And then opening that in Photoshop as a smart object, it uses Adobe Camera Raw's processing engine. So you can see here that there's the Adobe Camera Raw base file, and then upon that I have a folder with all of the different Adobe Camera Raw adjustments available. So I started with a negative exposure of 1 EV, and this is what Adobe Camera Raw does to your curve on your file if you minus 1 EV. Note that it's not a perfectly smooth negative curve. I assume that they've done multi-image blending with a negative gamma curve like this to get the smooth results. So that's negative 1 EV, that's negative 2 EV, and that's negative 3 EV. So you can see that it's this quite smooth negative gamma type curve. The positive exposure is the symmetrical inverse of this. Positive 1 EV, positive 2 EV, and positive 3 EV. I'm so glad that I managed to get this emulation of what Adobe Camera Raw does to your file with curves. Yes, it's just luminance, and I'm not sure how to get information about the color data yet, but it's still extremely useful. You can see that a positive adjustment in exposure looks like a gamma curve, which is pretty cool. So now I'm going to show you how shifting the curve slider in Adobe Camera Raw affects the histogram. So I'll click this on. This is 100% increase to the contrast, and you can see the S-curve that results. The midpoint of this S-curve is not quite the middle of the histogram. Then I put in an adjustment gradient which affected the whole image, so it's a multiplication of 2, and you can see that the S-curve increases. So this is 2 times 100 increase on the contrast slider. I also quickly want to show you the difference between process calibration versions because they result in different S-curves. The process calibration version 2 results in an S-curve which goes straight through the midpoint, and that's very smooth. However, the process calibration version 5, which is the most current ACR calibration profile, as you can see under here, that results in that curve that we saw before where the midpoint is slightly shifted. So you get a slightly darker result. So let's have a look at how shifting highlights and shadows affects the histogram. So this is with a decrease and increase in shadows and highlights. As you can see here, pushing the sliders in the opposite of the normal directions you would. You can see that this is the result. It's quite a smooth S-curve that increases contrast. It clips a little bit, and the midpoint is not exactly over the middle of the histogram. If I do the reverse, which is what you'd normally do, to reduce the highlights and increase the shadows, this is what you get. It's this quite uneven curve. So it's probably using image blending, which accounts for these little bumps in the curve. But this is the curve that essentially Camera Raw applies to your image when you reduce highlights and increase the shadows. So now I'm going to have a look at the whites and blacks sliders. If you increase them a lot, like this, 100 plus, minus 100, and you'll see what this does to the curve. You may be a bit surprised to realize that this is, again, not a symmetrical adjustment. You increase the whites to 100%, and the pivot point for the histogram is around here, which is well above the center of the histogram. And if I do a multiplication of 2, which is this, so this is, again, another gradient layer, which is affecting the entire image, plus 100 to the whites and minus 100 to the blacks. This is the resulting histogram. And if you switch between them, you can see that that pivot point is around here, which is not anywhere near the middle of the histogram. I'm also going to show you the linear decrease in contrast, which looks like this. And you can see this is nowhere near the inverse, which is increase the whites and decrease the blacks. If I show you what I've done here, which is reduce the whites to negative 100, increase the blacks to positive 100, you can see that there is this unusual curve. There is no clipping as such that is introduced. It's just quite different from the curve above, which is the opposite in values. Next, I'm going to show you spline curves, which is as expected. And when you have a look at negative contrast, however, you can see that it's the inverse of that spline curve. I made sure that the values were exactly the opposite. Now I'm going to show you the linear curve, and this is what you'd expect, a linear curve, input and output, which is the inverse for each point. It's a linear increase in contrast, the slope is increased, the dynamic range is reduced because of clipping on the whites and the blacks. And a decrease in linear contrast looks like this, as you'd expect. It's just shifting the black point up and shifting the white point down. In conjunction with what we just learned about how Adobe Camera Raw affects the curves, I want to show you how the different adjustment sliders affect the histogram so we can sort of sum up what's going on. If I take the exposure slider of this image, which I took a couple of years back, and push it to the right, you can see that the colors, say for example the blues, the cyans and the yellows, the distance between these colors is decreasing, and that's a sign of decreasing saturation. So as we push brighter and brighter, the saturation in the skies and the very bright parts is reducing, and that's sort of mimicking how the eye perceives really bright parts. It takes some time to adapt, but that's what they were doing with the exposure slider in process version 5. They're trying to mimic brightening a scene in the same way that we would perceive a brighter image. And if I push the slider to the left, you can see the same thing going darker. We have the blues and the yellows and the cyans squishing together, and there's a reduction in saturation. And now I'm going to increase the contrast slider, and you can see that that pushes either side of close to the midpoint, the data, so that it increases the perceived contrast. That's the distance between the brights and the blacks. But it does so by extending the distance between the different colors so that the perceived saturation is also increased. Another thing I wanted to demonstrate here is that an increase in the contrast slider such as this gives pretty much the same results as an increase in the curves like this. It's an S curve with a slight dip in the middle point. And when I switch over between the two, you can see that there's very little difference between the two in the histogram change. And now I'm going to move to negative 100, and you can see that that reduction in contrast pushes the colors back together, and you get this reduction in perceived saturation. It's probably quite closely linked with the luminance histogram, so this is probably correct when reducing the contrast down to this amount. Next is the highlights and shadow sliders. So if I increase the contrast a fair bit and then I reduce the highlights, you can see what it's doing. It's actually decreasing the contrast by bringing the data back towards the middle, but it's maintaining the distance between the colors. So the perceived saturation is maintained while a contrast reduction is achieved. We'll increase the shadows, and you can see it's bringing the data up the histogram to bring out the luminance in the shadows, but it maintains the distance, the separation between the colors, and that's why the saturation doesn't reduce. And now for the whites and black sliders. I wanted to show you using this file because it's much easier to demonstrate what happens with the blacks. So if I pull down the blacks, note that as we come towards clipping, the distance between the colors actually increases. And that's the non-linearity of white sliders and black sliders. If I increase the whites towards the right, note that just as we come towards clipping, there's a slight reduction between the distance of the colors. That is a difference between whites and blacks, and that's one reason why I try to use linear curves instead of whites and blacks for the clipping points. I've quickly jumped over to Lightroom because I want to show you something quickly about shadows and highlights. I've got this image here which has got a distinct edge between the bright parts and the dark parts, and you might be thinking, oh, it's too bright and too dark, so let's decrease the highlights and increase the shadows. And you probably come across this artifact yourselves if you do this too much, but you can see there's a haloing, like this uneven brightness between the leaves of the trees, and there's this haloing effect which looks totally unnatural. That's my biggest gripe with Adobe Camera Raw, is this haloing effect, and that will be discussed in a separate video on how to effectively and realistically reduce contrast. So back over to Photoshop, there's a couple more things I want to show you. This image here again, I want to show you the difference between white point increase and linear curve increase to get that clipping point in the clouds. So I've set the whites to 56 plus, which is just clipping in those clouds up there. And I've also created a preset showing the linear curves, which just also clips those white. Now, if I hover over that, you can see how it adjusts the image. The saturation is different and the contrast is different. So linear curves, which is this, pushing that white point across, that results in this nice linear increase in contrast, but it's not the same as a whites increase. The whites increase is some sort of discrete algorithm that Adobe have developed. I prefer the linear curves because I know it'll give me a predictable result each time. So I briefly want to demonstrate the realism of that contrast increase using linear curves. If I bring this white point across to the left, To increase the contrast, the histogram is moving to the right and in a totally predictable and static fashion. It means that the contrast is totally predictable. I'll push that across and you see it's just clipping there, and let's say I reduce it. Let's reduce the contrast like this. You can see I'm pushing that white point down, but you can see how totally even that change is. Let's move the black points to the right to do the same thing. It's pushing the contrast in such a natural and even way across to the left. It's totally realistic in my understanding. The last thing I want to show you is within Photoshop, some ways to increase contrast. We have this type of curve, which is an S curve, but has a knee rolling off, both in the highlights and the shadows. I'm going to compare that with a natural S curve. You can see that here, this is the type of curve. It means 1 point at the top and 1 point at the bottom. 4 becomes 0 and 251 becomes 255. So comparing the two, you can see that there's not all that much difference. I also want to show you the mid S curve, which is this one. That is where the points are right near the middle and you get an increase in mid-range contrast, but you get a sloping off of the contrast towards the brights and the darks. And the difference between that is this. There's some unusual effect in the mids. Yeah, you can see there's mid, almost like a clarity slider a little bit. The colors change a bit, but switching between the two opposite types of curves, we have the mid S curve, which I've just shown you this, and then we have the end S curve, which is much further apart than these are. You can see that the difference in how they look. Last thing I want to show you is how you can effectively increase the contrast using the equalize function. The equalize function, I created a duplicate copy of an RGB layer, and then I went to Image, Adjustments, Equalize, and it does this. This is too much. So with that duplicate layer, I just reduce the opacity until I get the desired result. And I think that looks pretty good. It's a pretty cool way of increasing contrast. Also did that in the LAB mode, luminance and then AB channels. You get a totally different result. So remember, equalize is a pretty good way to get good contrast from your images. In conclusion, you can see that most of these tools give quite different results. For landscape type images, I prefer realistic global type adjustments. I tend to use the exposure slider to get the right brightness. Then I use a contrast slider and linear curves to get the desired contrast and clipping points. I try to avoid using the whites and blacks sliders as their transformations are not as pure as linear curves. With highlights and shadows recovery, try to keep the adjustments to a minimum because unnatural haloing will result if you push too far. So that's it for today. What are your thoughts about contrast? How do you get the best contrast out of your images? Please comment below, and as always, like, subscribe with notifications, and share with your friends. Thanks for joining me. See ya.